Was there a question?
The Dalai Lama incarnation.
Reincarnation, yes.
Whole concept and what is it? Where it's coming from?
When we talk about Buddhism in the 21st century, the common person, the regular person who hears about it, immediately, chances are immediately they're going to think about or be reminded of the Dalai Lama. Because, let's face it, he's a celebrity. He's been around in the media for many years. I remember when Apple was becoming the Apple Macintosh, the computer company, was coming up with its new products. I don't know if it was the iPod or the iPhone. They had these billboards in Los Angeles, and one more intriguing than the other. Be different, think different, or be unique. Slogans like that. And I remember for one of the earliest billboards they had chosen a picture of the Dalai Lama. Now, people are shocked when I tell them that that is a tradition that came up, the Vajrayana, which is the Tantrayana, or the religion that we see not just in Tibet, but also parts of Japan and some parts of China and Mongolia. But the one that we're talking about in particular, which is the Tibetan tradition of Buddhism, it is so different than the teachings that we find from the historical Buddha from India. But in particular, seeing that the original question was about reincarnation, given what we're hearing in the news and that mystical aspect of that people are intrigued mostly by, that is absent from the teachings of Lord Buddha. And that is a completely exotic, something that was completely later added, layer by layer, chunk by chunk, from what we have from the Mahayana tradition, and then also the Mahasiddha tradition that was spreading throughout India from Central Asia, which eventually found its way to Tibet. So the Dalai Lama's tradition happens to be the Gelugpa tradition, which is the youngest, actually, the youngest tradition from the Tibetan schools of Buddhism. There's several, from what I recall. There's the Nyingma, which is one of the oldest, and there's the Kagyupa tradition, there's the Sakya, there's the Gelugpa. These are the primary ones. So the Gelugpa, they came around the 14th century, Common Era. So we're talking about 1800 years after the Buddha, which is a long time. And many things had already happened. So this reincarnation part was not something that was known in any of the other traditions within the Tibetan, when I say traditions, the Tibetan schools of Buddhism that I mentioned. Nyingma, by the way, is the least, because it has more of the ancestral or old Tibetan pagan and other elements that it fused the Buddhist teachings into. So the the Tibetan culture is very much alive in all of these, but especially within the Nyingmapa tradition. But the Gelugpa tradition was like any other. However, so in addition to having the chief Lama or the Dalai Lama of that tradition, in time they were given the rulership position of the entire country of Tibet, or the population, the Tibetan population. So, and every other tradition was okay with, however, there were a lot of rivalries within the Gelugpa and the dominant, the governing powers of Tibet. So what happened was, during the past 150 years or so, there's been many Dalai Lamas. So sometimes people forget that this Dalai Lama is not like the other Dalai Lamas who, we presume that they also lived as long as he has been living. No, some of them actually only reigned for about a year, few months, because there were a series of assassinations going on within Tibet to take over. And so it's a very political thing that this reincarnation business really served those in power and those who wanted to stay in power and those who wanted to use those in power. So, which has nothing to do with Buddhism. But I wanted to just mention a few things about how did this reincarnation thing come into this branch of Buddhism, which I'm just going to call Tibetan Buddhism in this case, which also could be a definition for Tantrayana or Mantrayana, etc. You see, as I mentioned in the beginning about Mahasiddhas, or the great, those with psychic powers, and there were several. What happened was, there was a teacher in India, one of those vagabond, mystical teachers. His name is Tilopa. And he was very odd. He was very, he did not fit, he did not color between the lines, within the lines. So he is known to be the father of the Kagyupa tradition. And that is the tradition to which Tibetan Buddhism owes this whole reincarnation principle or phenomenon that you find in all these traditions now in Tibetan Buddhism. So Tilopa ended up having a student. His name was Naropa, and he was one of the he was one of the teachers at Nalanda University. So he was one of those teachers. However, he got expelled because one time he was discovered that he was having a sexual intercourse in his kuti. And of course, later traditions mention how it was not a human being, it was some type of divine being, and this was just him transmuting the sexual energy to go to higher states of awakening. Again, this had nothing to do and has nothing to do with the teachings that we call Dhamma or Buddhism. This was completely something foreign. So he got expelled, and he was a rogue. He was, basically kicked out. So that is a defeat. We call it parajika in the Vinaya. He was defeated, therefore disrobed. He could not become a monk again in that lifetime. So he finds Tilopa, and Tilopa trains him, and he gives him these secret teachings. One of them is to transferring consciousness. I think it was in Tibetan it's called Poa, which they concentrate and they just intend on sending the consciousness from the top of the head to any living being who just died or about to be, conceived somewhere. So eventually, so you had that tradition, and then you have Marpa, who was a lay Buddhist Tibetan. He traveled a few times. I think he traveled 3 times from Tibet. In those days, it was almost suicide. But he not only reached India, but he also was able to go back and take these teachings with him to Tibet, and the Kagyu tradition teachings. So eventually he was entrusted with these so-called secret teachings, the Mahasiddhas. And then Marpa later, he had a student, the famous of all teachers, Milarepa, or the snow-clad yogi of Tibet, and Milarepa. And he was Marpa's student. And then from Milarepa we had Gampopa, or Gampo, and that is basically the core of the original Kagyu tradition. And sometimes they're also called the black hats. By the way, the Gelugpa tradition is called the yellow hats, and then I think the Nyingma are called the red hats. So you see, these have nothing to do with the original teachings of the Buddha, but they were influenced by, as Buddhism does, everywhere it goes, it takes on the flavorings, or rather it becomes dissolved and even, shall we say, polluted. Because many of the teachings, like the transference of consciousness, what is it that's being transferred? Because what they're saying is not jati, which is rebirth. That is the principle that Lord Buddha taught. But what it is reincarnation, meaning the consciousness of this person gets to be transferred to a new body. Well, that is the Brahmanic belief that was there at the time of the Buddha. So what changes did occur? This was totally non-Buddhist. So the reincarnation, I'm not criticizing the Tibetan tradition. That's, I'm not in a position to do any such thing. However, I'm looking at the reincarnation part, which unfortunately Tibetan Buddhism came to be known for. And that is has no Buddhist elements to it. Now, of course, over the centuries, starting from the 14th century, by the way, time-wise, the Kagyu were already around the 1100 Common Era and then on. So Gampopa, he taught his own, I believe it was his son, how to do the Poa, or the transference of consciousness. And I think there was a story of him transferring his consciousness to a dead, just newly killed or died dove or pigeon. And his consciousness goes there, and there's all these things which really have nothing to do with the Dhamma. Now, over the centuries, what you had were the other traditions of Ishtar from the Mesopotamian and Phoenician cultures, and then you had Manichaeism, you had even elements of Christianity, obviously Brahmanism, all these things coming in to be fused and adding their own teachings onto the Dhamma that Lord Buddha taught, to the point where they suffocated it. So it usually gets a very little bit of the attention versus the other elements that are advocated, such as this reincarnation, to the point where the Dalai Lama was, that is what they started to see as, by the way, the criterion of authenticity, meaning the transference of consciousness, so that they could keep a lineage going, such as, oh, it is such and such a teacher who has been now reborn in this body, in this village, so we have to go and find that little boy. This has nothing to do with the Dhamma. So, but they had to add more mystical elements to it. That's how you have Avalokiteshvara, or Chenrezi, they call it in Tibet. This is the same one as Kuan Yin, who you see in China. Or Ishtar, as I said, Avalokiteshvara, Ishtar, Chenrezi, Kuan Yin, they're pretty much talking about the same principle. And now that is also the Dalai Lama is seen, believed, and identified, recognized as the reincarnation of Avalokiteshvara or Chenrezig. Again, doesn't have anything to do with the teachings of Lord Buddha. These were just later elements, and because there is no understanding of proper rebirth principles, because you are now looking for the wrong things as the measures of a teacher. And sadly, so many people have died. As I mentioned, the Dalai Lamas who were killed by the Tibetans because it was all political. And I think recently the Dalai Lama, about 10 years ago, 7 years ago, he relinquished the rulership, political position of his title as the head of the Tibetan people. So he's simply the head of the Gelugpa tradition. So that is what is good to be reminded of. And there's more things to be said about this. However, these are just like, almost like Hollywood, curiosities and things that people completely miss out. These things have become the highlight. And in the world of politics, these have been things that, major powers have been using. And I think to the detriment of the people who are truly devout and faithful. And they really believe in this. They really believe in this. So, in the rites and rituals. But that's not what the Dhamma is based on. Again, I'm not trying to compare and contrast, because I just wanted to give it like a historical, roughly, without getting into too much details, of the background on this subject of reincarnation. It can really be confusing for people. But it has its romantic, it has this poetic thing, this almost like it's a screenplay, a Hollywood screenplay. Monks going through the snowy peaks trying to find this one little boy who has been born with certain insignia and certain abilities that would demonstrate that this is their teacher. Well, guess what? So many of these teachers, tulkus, rinpoches, ended up getting into sexual, what do you call it? Big fiascos happened, and many of them have been sued. And breaking of sila, there's no virtue in many cases. Some were drunk, some were having sex with their students. They were putting on the robes, disrobing, putting on the robes, getting married, having children, and then putting on the robes and continuing teaching. Simply because somebody somewhere mentioned in the past that they were recognized as the reincarnation of such and such a teacher, or in the past. this is just, has nothing to do with the Dhamma. That's what I keep saying. And what is the Dhamma? That is what each of us have to, if we're interested, to go ahead and explore it for ourselves. That's why we have the suttas, the discourses. You have to go to the source. You have to go to the teachings of Lord Buddha to understand what it means to be a Buddhist. And no, you don't have to get advanced degrees or go and wear robes for a long period of time, be ordained in order for you to understand. No, it's very simple. There is suffering in life. That's the first principle. And then the second is that there's an escape. There is a release. There's an ending of this suffering. If you could just remember that, that is the essence of Lord Buddha's teaching. So how is the belief in some reincarnated person from a past really going to help you? Other than engender in you this blind faith in this thing which you cannot touch, you cannot, the authenticity of which you cannot prove, you cannot test. It's just other people's beliefs. And in the Kalama Sutta, we see very clearly how Lord Buddha says you should not follow simply because a teacher simply because others are treating that person as a teacher. There's this legendary past about them. There's this mysticism about them. They have many followers. They have a celebrity status. They have, they speak nicely, or they're funny, or they're appealing. None of these things qualify. None. To make a person become a teacher in this Dhamma and discipline. One has to become one's own teacher, ultimately. But having a teacher there is necessary at times to help us, to guide us, to identify what is wholesome from what is unwholesome, what is kusala from what is akusala. And believing in some teacher, treating them like a guru, is definitely akusala in this Dhamma and discipline, because it is not getting us rid of the non-virtuous characteristics that we have been dragging behind us throughout many, many lifetimes. So how is my personality transforming with this belief in this person, in that person, or taking sides here and there? It's just nonsense. We came alone and we're going to go alone. But in the meantime, what are we doing to reduce the suffering that we have? And there is a step-by-step process. It's not a matter of just, have compassion to others, have compassion to others, be nice to others, do good things. Well, people were doing all those things before the Buddha showed up, There's a difference why this is still called the Buddha Sasana. The dispensation of a living Buddha is still available. We can still talk about him. So that is huge. So people were doing good deeds, people were having compassion and love towards each other, but there was no wisdom. So following someone simply in this whole reincarnation business does not bring about wisdom. It brings about a lot of attachment. That's why many people convert or walk away from their religions and adopt this new religion. But it's just changing robes, changing your coat. You used to be Christian, now you're a Buddhist. And when I ask you what kind of Buddhist, I'm a student of Vajrayana or Tibetan Buddhism. Oh, okay. I love this teacher. I was like, okay, wonderful. Why? They don't have an answer for that. Other than, I love the way he speaks, the way he does, the way he wears his baseball cap. I think he's so down to earth. I was like, what does that have to do with the Dhamma? How is that changing you? How is that bringing more of a sense of virtue within you? How is that helping with your mental cultivation? How, even more so importantly, how does that bring in a sense of, or understanding, discernment, and wisdom into your life? Where you no longer are going to behave in the way that you did before. In fact, you're able to, how is that allowing you to become able to attain to the first, second, third, or even fourth level of awakening? There's none. So, there are many elements that have survived and call themselves Buddhists. But when we compare with the original teachings of Lord Buddha that come to us from the Pali Canon, from the historical Buddha that lived and existed and died, and no, he did not transfer his consciousness, okay? And one other thing which these people are not able to explain is well, there are principles that Lord Buddha clearly distinguished, and anybody who claims themselves to be Buddhist, they will have to abide by this, okay, if they still call themselves Buddhist. And what is this that I'm referring to? The 4 stages of awakening, the first of which is a Sotapanna. The most lives that they have, and this is in case that they are extremely neglectful, heedless. In such cases, this is a first stage awakened one, the one who has seen the Dhamma. At the most, they will have no more than 7 more lifetimes. 7. Until they become fully awakened. The next category are the Sakadagami, who are the once returners. That, as the name indicates, they will come back only once, either to a Deva realm or to a human realm. Once, and that's it, until they become awakened fully. And then third are the Anagamis. They will never return to the human realm for sure, the Deva realms also, and they will only be reborn in a pure abode where only Anagamis who have overcome the first set of 5 Sangyojanas, which we call fetters. And then we have the Arahants. Those are the fully awakened ones. They never come back. And that's what all the other 3 categories I mentioned, they will end up being Arahants. As I mentioned, the longest, the one who will take the longest is a Sotapanna, who at the most will have no more than 7 lifetimes. So when you take that into account, and you look at this whole reincarnation business that we see in Tibetan Buddhism, where this teacher keeps popping up, keeps showing up in this part of the world, that part of the world, and there's monks who go and they validate and they do these tests and this and that. Some of them have been supposedly reincarnating again and again, and they are always recognized as individuals who have already awakened. Well, do you see the contradiction? This does not agree at all with the teachings of Lord Buddha. Because if the teacher had been fully awakened, that would make them an Arahant. And that would mean that that life in which they attained Arahantship, that was their very last life. There's no way they would come back. It's impossible. Lights out, that's it. Because they have no more craving. It's as simple as that. So this is mumbo. It's like real messy non-Buddhist elements that have been added that confuse a lot of people. And this path is not about creating confusion at all. So if a person is fully awakened, they cannot reincarnate. There's no reincarnation as such to begin with. It's just rebirth, which means based on the conditions presented, based on the intentionality of the person, based on the presence of craving. The consciousness will move at the moment of death. And if all the conditions are met properly, and there's nama rupa joined together at the moment of conception, guess what? There's life. There's a new birth because of the craving, the desire to become again, bhava we call it, in Lord Buddha's teachings, bhava. But if there isn't, which means the person has penetrated through with insight, they have wisdom, and they are now arahants, there's no ground, there's no substrate for it to land. It just dissolves there and there. It's gone. The consciousness doesn't have any place to stand. No birth in any mother's womb, any realm. So this is just a fictional thing. People have come up with these things, and they have no place in the Lord Buddha's teachings. So be mindful of these, and it is your responsibility to practice your due diligence, and this is your life. You don't have to take my word for it at all. Otherwise you would be doing the same thing as I was saying people are doing, with believing someone simply because they have access to some, followers or known or this and that. No, go ahead and do your own work in investigating, to at least check to see if my statements are correct. Lord Buddha called the Dhamma ehipassiko. And these traditions, these things that they do, keep coming up with, and they continue on misinterpreting or misdirecting people, misinterpreting the Dhamma as to how they want to see it. They're causing so much harm to both themselves and to the teachings, which is causing them, the teachings, to die faster and to be wiped out off the face of the earth sooner. So this path is about personal responsibility and believing in someone being the reincarnation of Avalokiteshvara or some enlightened person. That's not Buddhist. That's more Christian than Buddhist. Okay?